is Gede, Parma, and first of all I'd like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from Gadigal and Bijigal country, and I acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge the old people, the dreaming, and that the First Nations people and communities are still thriving and strong in the face of colonization and occupation. So, my name is Theo, and I guess the first thing that feels important to say is that my context, my multicultural and multi-ethnic background is contextualized by Balinese Hinduism and Balinese culture, having been born there and connected to that thread of living lineage, as well as like a white settler of Irish and British and Scottish descent mother who grew up on a chicken farm in southeast Queensland. And so these two main, I guess, ancestral currents really contextualize and focus me and my work. And they also support and I guess illumine a lot of the ways that I attempt to and aspire to live my life. The other thing that's important to know, to contextualize, I guess, a bunch of what I'm going to say, is that I work within traditions of folkloric and ecstatic witchcraft, which are oracular, spirit-working, transgressive, practical mysticisms that are based in, I believe, and I teach this way and practice this way, based in body wholeness, body diversity, cosmologies and theologies. And what I mean by that is that in traditional and folkloric forms of witchery, which are very much based on lore and legend, fairy tale, ritual, superstition, folklore, and old paganisms as syncretized with different religious realities and historical circumstances, we have a strong idea and experience that we, or this one, or this landscape of being, this vault of living memory, is multiplex. In the traditions I work within, we have a triple soul understanding, and this is actually all the body. So it's not that the body is this one apportioned, segmented, mechanistic mode, and that the soul or the spirit is different in any way. In fact, it's more of a spiral and a continuum and a labyrinth. And so working in this way and supported by the animism and magic and ritual of my childhood has allowed me to, I guess, experience in the sensuous, intimate, direct manner what I call the body is the book and the book is the land, which is the beginning of a very sacred prayer from the Wildwood tradition. And I invite you to notice that you're a living, breathing animal. I feel like this is important first, rather than just getting too cerebral. So just noticing that you are breathing alive, that you are being breathed. And if you notice any tension or any sensations, just acknowledging them and being with them in the breath, in the rhythm of the breath. Maybe you make your exhalation a little longer, a little wider, a little deeper. And maybe you can let your shoulders relax, let your face relax if this is possible, relaxing into the landscape of your own being, made up of so many tributaries and rivers and oceans and wells. Knowing that we carry all of this ancestral lineage, and so we carry the resonance of trauma, we carry joy and blessing, we carry tears and grief and reparation, we carry desire for justice. We carry very simple things, very ornate things. We carry the dying of stars. We carry entire forests and deserts and mountains. And all of this situated in this one. And I invite you to whisper these words: my body is the book, and the book is the land. My body is the book, and the book is the land. My body is the book, and the book is The Land. And I just invite you to notice and perceive from that place, from a more spacious, from a more inward perhaps, or a more anchored and grounded state, as you listen and open and connect throughout your day and your night. So, to continue on, let me just look at my notes. I also want to talk about how all within the cauldron of body, everything happens in this cauldron of body. And basically, I think many kind of schooling systems, certainly state sanctioned schooling systems, religious, mainstream religious theologies and philosophies, whether they're called that or not, they all, political agendas, political paradigms, they all weave together into a very imperialist agenda. And we know this to be true. We are kind of caught in that mess right now. And many different systems that we are deeply familiar with, some in different ways than others. Maybe the material impact of these systems impacts you, maybe in a more direct, immediate, current way than another. And of course, this is all intersecting. So all of these sacred bodies are touching other sacred bodies, laughing with sacred bodies, eating sacred bodies, dying into sacred bodies, conjuring sacred bodies, fusing with sacred bodies, fragmenting sacred bodies. So it's not that the sacred has gone, it's that we almost have been collectively in the so-called West, certainly blinded and complicit in that blinding at times at different levels and different tones. The practice of ritual as a body-based ecstasy, as a body-based eros, aims to orient us to the living sacred. That is the point of ritual. There is a quote that's kind of flows through many communities, and at this point I'm actually not sure where it began. I think possibly it could be traced back to Jungian psychotherapy or dream analysis. But there's this idea that is common in many indigenous cultures and many primary cultures, that dreams are how the mystery or the quote-unquote unconscious communicate with us, and ritual is how we communicate back. Ritual, singing, prayer, art, theatre, in this way, which are all components of what we're calling ritual or ceremony, are meant to activate certain sacred truths and realities and orient us to those things so that we are able to become part and constantly weave ourselves in to this participation of mutual sacred reciprocity. So of course ritual can be conceptual too for those who need that or want that, and it has that layer. But ritual also has a deeper effect for the collective consciousness of communities. So one of the, I guess, realities of that, or my earliest impact, was witnessing sacred transpossession, an oracular kind of prophecy in Balinese villages and societies on the island of Bali. And so they're a very specific, unique, syncretic, kind of evolving over hundreds of years, cultus of Hinduism, Buddhism, traditional animism has fused to allow for there to be a speaking with and to and from the land, not as humans who are somehow away from or special or distinct from the land, but as part of a greater ecology, as part of a greater kinship network. Things like possession, for instance, which is a really, I guess, for some people listening to this, might be a very intense word, or a word that triggers or just reminds us of strange films and strange Christianist ideas. I would say propagandist ideas against traditional culture, because most of the billions of humans on this planet have these experiences and interact with spirits on a daily basis. This allows the self, or what we consider to be the phenomenon of self, to be less kind of held by these ideas of what that needs to be according to the society at large in a stratified manner. So when we allow ourselves to surrender and fuse with and become part of greater bodies, or even carry bodies of other beings, ancestors, landscapes, mountains, which can often considered to be gods or spirits, and then allow ourselves to be carried by that, we are actively participating in kind of a psychic health. So these practices enable communities to have direct access to very mysterious sources of information, which for generations have been deeply helpful to the pragmatic running and ordering of human society in relationship with the more than human and the other than human. So many are almost all culture traditionally is formed by a sacred kinship with the more than human. It cannot not be that way. And so ritual and ceremony happens with and through the body and allows us to be fused with and connected to other distinct bodies, but also to allow us to have erotic intimacy or sensuous intimacy with other bodies in a way that is often different from human procreation only. And so what this does, so societies that have ritual and ceremony in these intact ways or these revived ways, as several Eastern European nations have been able to do, as they were kind of less thoroughly Christianized and later Christianized, and as many places that might seem Christian or like colonized by certain kind of like political religious ideologies, underneath there's often a lot of folk ritual happening. And I would implore and kind of provoke anyone listening to consider what are some of the fragments or the threads of folk ritual or folk superstition or folk custom that actually does travel down the lineage of my ancestral body? What have I heard my aunties, my uncles, my siblings, my cousins, my grandparents say about certain things? And we learn a lot also from what might be missing, what we feel is missing. Unfortunately, of course, in the great, I guess, very active dispossessing of various traditional peoples and various traditional societies, there has been a kind of cut off the roots reality, which maybe was previously discussed in another session today. But when this happens, obviously, human animals, we're trying to grapple to reconnect and repair these broken threads. Ultimately, it's all through the cauldron and crucible of body. And something that I like to say kind of as an affirmation, as a prayer, as a spell, is that body is deeper, wilder, and wiser than we are taught. So if I keep reminding myself of that, then I'm going to constantly avail myself in intellectual ways, in non-intellectual ways, in deeply emotional ways, and usually it's often through the emotional way that we get to the mystical, through that intimacy with the other, with the mystery, that I'm going to be able to avail myself of various modes of thinking and feeling and sensing that are missing from the techno-industrialist, capitalist, imperialist hierarchy all around us, from this kind of many-headed hydra of bullshit. So in the face of people who might be very happy to live in fragmentation, whatever, ritual is often theater to some people. Ritual is often art because it is these things. And ritual can be done in a way where it's happening on that kind of interesting crevice between private and public, so that we are engendering a reminder. I'm noticing so much lately that there is more and more in popular culture and media in the so-called West that is basically about trying to reclaim, maybe especially for people of European descent, like pre-Christian, pagan, tribal, indigenous roots, clan roots. Sometimes it's about what we feel we're missing. So sometimes it's just poetry or sensuality or mythology. Most of what many people spend their time reading and viewing is not even indicative of the actual systems that are running the kind of the show at large. It's more a yearning and longing, for that fantasy sci-fi stuff, which is reminding us of the past, and maybe also maybe it's revisionist in the sense that we're trying to project into a future we would like to live in. And again, this is all about communication, interrelation, and being able to be multidimensionally aware, which are skill sets that need to be taught basically at this point, again, in certain places. These are skill sets of sensing and perceiving the life force, the sensuality of things, the sexuality of things, the eroticism of things, and being able to mindfully, emotionally powerfully navigate these things so that we are participating in right relationship and that we can come back to right relationship. None of this happens in a vacuum. None of this happens in isolation. And the practice of ritual, and by its very nature, this is rhythmic and regular, whether it's with the tides of the cycles of the seasons in the bioregion you're in, certain things fruiting, certain creatures proliferating, certain tides of the moon, of the light, of darkness, of decay, of moisture, of humidity. Certainly as we're tying ourselves back into that, we are also communicating to each other that this is what is sustaining us. This is supporting the very fabric of our life. And so I guess as one of the great cultural, like in terms of what this is being called, this permaqueer curation of wonder, this like cultural responses to climate change or climate crisis, that's ritual and ecstatic practice is so important, because if we are not being nourished, and nourishment is so different from comfort. So convenience and comfort, that's an interesting kind of lulling spell that capitalism casts over the middle class, right? And hangs like a carrot over the working class. But nourishment, to be truly nourished, I think that's what people are trying to say when we're talking about self-care, which is obviously become a buzzword, but underneath that, there's something very real. And maybe one of the last things I'd like to share before we transition into, I guess, a different part of this, is that at the core of how I think and feel about this is 3 concentric circles. The way this originally was being spoken of in my spiritual community was as self. So if you can picture or see or draw or trace with your finger 3 concentric rings that go outward, and obviously they go inward too. So the one in the center we would call self, and then outward from that we would call community, and then outward from that we would call cosmos. Now, this is a way to think and track about relationship and right relationship and intimacy, and also accountability, because it all comes back to self. Interestingly, maybe 7 years later, after that was being kind of very consolidated in my spiritual community, I was sitting with an Aboriginal elder of Mununjali and Wanjerabara descent, Auntie Ruby Rose, an amazing woman and elder. And she was talking to me about these 3 concentric rings that help her map relationship. And she called the one in the middle discipline, the one going out from that community, and the one outward from that mother. And I remember sitting there with one of my co-priestesses and being blown away at the exact parallelness of this. And so it all comes, I love also that she called it the central one, discipline, which is a word I love. I love that word. One of the elders of another tradition I work within, they would say that discipline, when we think of discipline, let's think about what is the teaching. So rather than discipline being something that someone else makes you do or coerces from you because you should, what is the teaching? Discipline, disciple, what is the teaching here? And so ritual, ecstatic, body-based, erotic, intimate, sensual practice, alignment, purification, connection, movement, art, dancing, spell work, prayer work, ancestor veneration. This is all meant to be completely a spell and a process of reintegration at all times. And as a part of that, it will mean that we disintegrate sometimes. It will mean that we go through rites of passage that all traditional societies possess. Initiation is something at the heart of the mysticism I practice. Unfortunately, it is missing, like true initiation as a rite of passage that is witnessed and held by others and the spirits and the ancestors and the land is missing from the, hyphen, dash, the hierarchy, the Western Empire. It's missing from those things. And so generally, from childhood to adulthood, we would be initiated. And then, of course, there's other initiations into specialities, and obviously spirit work is one of those. So that's a really important thing to remember. It all comes back to the discipline of the self in relationship to the community, which is more than human, in relationship to what Auntie Ruby Rose calls the mother, what I would call cosmos or happily mother, the ground of being. And this is all a body, My spirit is no different than the body. It's one spiral, one snake, one song.